When my dad passed, my brother Dylan got everything. The mansion, the Lamborghini, even the company shares. Everyone said he earned it because he was the successful one. I got a small envelope with a single key inside, labeled only attic, no explanation, no letter, just that key. At first I thought it was a cruel joke, one last reminder that I was the forgotten son, but when I went back to the old house and turned that key, what I found in the attic made me realize why Dad left it for me, and not for Dylan. The day of the will reading felt like a quiet punishment. Everyone smiled politely, but their eyes said what they were too polite to say, that Dylan deserved it all, and I didn't. The lawyer read the list in a calm voice, his tone so dry it made everything sound ordinary. Dylan's name came up again and again, while mine appeared only once. A small key, nothing else. I remember the way people looked at me, some with pity, others with quiet satisfaction, as if I got exactly what I deserved. Dylan clapped my shoulder afterward, pretending to be sympathetic. He always did that, made small gestures that seemed kind but carried a hint of victory. I smiled and said I was fine, though I wasn't. The truth was, I had been used to losing for so long that I didn't even know how to be angry anymore. I walked out of that office with the envelope in my pocket, not realizing I was carrying the only thing my father ever meant specifically for me. When I got home, I placed the envelope on my kitchen table and stared at it for hours. I wasn't sure if I wanted to open it. The handwriting on the label was unmistakably my dad's, a little shaky but clear. I ran my thumb over the word attic and felt an odd chill. I thought about all the times Dad told us to stay away from that attic when we were kids. He said it was dangerous, filled with old wiring and broken floorboards. I never questioned it until that night. I finally tore the envelope open and held the key in my hand. It was small, brass, and heavier than I expected. The moment I touched it, I felt something shift inside me. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was resentment. I wanted to know what was so special about that attic, that Dad would keep it locked even from his sons. Dylan never cared about things like that. He liked control, not mystery. But I couldn't stop thinking about what this key might unlock. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the attic door, dusty and untouched. I remembered how Dad used to pause by it when walking down the hallway, like he was guarding it. Sometimes I thought I saw him glance at it with fear, not nostalgia. I realized I had never seen him open it, not once in my life. The more I thought about it, the more I knew I had to see what was behind that door, even if it meant breaking the only rule he ever enforced. The next morning I drove to the mansion before Dylan could move in. The long driveway looked overgrown, and the gate hung slightly off its hinge. It didn't feel like home anymore. The air inside the house was thick with dust and old wood, the smell instantly pulling me back to childhood memories. Every sound echoed, making the place feel emptier than I remembered. I climbed the staircase slowly, my hand brushing along the rail where Dad's used to be. It felt like walking through someone else's past. The attic door was at the far end of the hallway behind a tall cabinet. I moved it aside, coughing from the dust that filled the air. The key fit perfectly in the lock, which surprised me. The metal turned smoothly, like it had been waiting for years. My heart beat faster, not from fear but something close to it. I opened the door carefully and felt a gust of dry air brush my face. The smell was strange, like paper, rust, and something faintly sweet. The attic was filled with old boxes stacked unevenly against the walls. Sunlight slipped through cracks in the roof, cutting across the room in narrow lines. I stepped carefully, hearing the floor creak under my shoes. It wasn't the kind of attic filled with forgotten toys or furniture. It felt deliberate, like someone arranged everything to be found in a certain order. There was a small chest sitting near the center of the room, half covered with a blanket. That's where my eyes stayed. I knelt beside the chest and brushed the dust off. It was wooden, dark, and carved with a pattern I didn't recognize. There was another lock on it, small, circular, and worn. I tried the same attic key and to my surprise, it turned. Inside were letters, photographs, and a small red thread coiled neatly around a card. I didn't understand what I was looking at. The photos showed my brother and me as kids, but in each one someone had scratched my face out with a pen. I stared at the ruined photos for a long time, feeling something twist in my chest. Whoever did it wasn't just angry, they were hurt. The letters looked old, their edges yellowed. One of them had my name written on it in my father's handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it. The first line made my stomach tighten. It said he had done something unforgivable, something he hoped I would one day understand. I stopped reading halfway through, unsure if I wanted to know more. Before I could continue, I heard a faint sound from outside. It was the slow, distant ringing of a bell. I froze. There wasn't a church anywhere near the property. The sound faded just as quickly as it came, leaving the air strangely heavy. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my pocket. The attic suddenly felt different, like the temperature had dropped. I told myself it was just nerves, but deep down I knew I had uncovered something that wasn't meant to stay hidden. As I turned to leave, the beam of sunlight from the roof shifted across the floor, landing on a box I hadn't noticed before. It was smaller than the others and covered in dust so thick it looked almost gray. Something about it felt intentional, like it had been placed to be found after everything else. I walked toward it slowly, heart pounding again. When I lifted the lid, I saw another envelope, this one sealed with wax and marked only with my father's initials. I didn't open it right away. I sat down instead, staring at it in my hands. I felt this mix of fear and excitement that made it hard to breathe. The room was quiet except for the occasional creak from the roof. My father's presence felt heavy in that space, as if he was still guarding whatever secrets were buried there. I finally decided I'd read the letter later, when I was ready. For now, I just needed to leave before the silence drove me crazy. I closed the attic door behind me and stood in the hallway for a minute, trying to steady myself. Dust floated in the sunlight, drifting like slow snow. I looked at the key still in my hand and wondered what else it might open. Maybe the letter inside that box would explain everything. Maybe it would break whatever illusion I had left about my family. For the first time in years, I felt something stronger than resentment. I felt curiosity, real, dangerous curiosity. When I finally stepped outside, the wind had picked up. The air smelled like rain, even though the sky was clear. I glanced back at the house and noticed how lifeless it looked. It wasn't a home anymore, it was a vault, a place built to hold secrets. Dylan could have the mansion and the cars. I had the attic key, and something told me that was worth more than anything money could buy. I just didn't realize yet how much it was about to change my life. That night I placed the attic key on my nightstand and kept staring at it in the dark. Every creak from the apartment ceiling made me think of that house. I couldn't stop wondering what else was hidden up there. My father's letter had said too little, and that only made it worse. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept returning to that sound. The bell ringing out of nowhere. It felt like a warning or maybe a memory trying to surface. Either way, I knew I'd go back. The next morning I woke up early and drove to the old house again. The sky was gray and the air smelled damp, like rain was coming. I parked at the end of the driveway, afraid Dylan might show up and question why I was there. The front door creaked when I pushed it open, echoing through the empty rooms. I went straight upstairs, not hesitating this time. The attic key turned easily again, like the door had been opened recently. That thought made my chest tighten. When I stepped inside, the air felt warmer than before. I noticed small details I had missed. The way dust settled in certain spots, how the boxes were arranged like someone had organized them carefully. I opened a few near the entrance, finding old family albums, receipts, and papers tied with string. Some of them were dated years before Dylan and I were born. A few had Mom's handwriting. Seeing it made something twist inside me. She had been gone since I was a kid, and no one ever talked about her. I found another small chest tucked under a table. Inside was a collection of cigars labeled with my father's name. They looked expensive, imported from somewhere in South America. Next to them was a folded bus ticket dated 1999. That year stuck with me because it was when Mom disappeared. Everyone said she left without a word. But seeing that ticket made me doubt everything I'd been told. The destination printed on it wasn't far. It was a town only a few hours away. That didn't sound like someone running forever. I sat down on a dusty old chair and tried to make sense of it. If she didn't run away, then what happened? The letter my father left suddenly felt heavier in my pocket. Maybe that was what he couldn't bring himself to say. I noticed a faint ringing again, that same bell sound. It was so soft it almost blended with the wind. I looked out the small attic window but saw nothing outside. The longer I listened, the more I felt like it wasn't coming from anywhere near. I opened another box and found clothes that clearly belonged to Mom. Scarves, a worn sweater, and an old perfume bottle that still faintly smelled like her. The scent hit me hard. Memories of her face, her voice, the way she used to hum on rainy mornings, all came back at once. I hadn't thought about her in years because it hurt too much, but now, surrounded by her things, I realized how much had been erased from our home. My father must have hidden all of this on purpose. Inside one of the boxes was an envelope marked with Dad's handwriting again, but this one wasn't addressed to anyone. It simply said, "Keep quiet for his sake." I read those words again and again, trying to guess what they meant. Whose sake? Dylan's? Mine? It didn't make sense. I slid the envelope open and found a single page, but half of it was torn away. What remained hinted at guilt, at protecting someone from the truth. I folded it carefully and added it to my growing pile of secrets. The sound of the bell returned, sharper this time. I turned off my flashlight and stood completely still. The air had changed. It was heavier, thicker, almost pressing against my chest. My breathing echoed faintly in the silence. I tried to remind myself that it was just my imagination, that old houses made noises, that bells sometimes carried from miles away, but part of me didn't believe that anymore. There was something about that sound that felt too perfectly timed, as if it came whenever I uncovered something important. The power suddenly went out. My flashlight flickered twice before shutting off completely. For a moment I stood in total darkness, trying not to panic. I reached for my phone, but even its light felt dim against the blackness around me. I could still smell the faint trace of perfume and the dusty scent of old wood. Then I heard a soft thud like something had fallen. I aimed the phone light toward the sound and saw that one of the boxes had tipped over on its own. I went to pick it up and found another envelope hidden beneath it. This one sealed tightly. It said, "For whoever still believes in truth." My hands shook as I tore it open. Inside was a folded paper and a small photo. The paper was my birth certificate, but the last name printed on it wasn't the same as my father's. My stomach dropped. The room felt like it spun for a second. The letter confirmed it. My father wasn't my biological dad. I just sat there gripping the paper, unable to breathe. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady myself. Everything I believed about my childhood suddenly felt like a lie. All the distance between Dad and me, all the unspoken tension. It wasn't rejection, it was guilt. I looked down at the photo. It showed Mom standing beside a man I didn't recognize, holding me as a baby. The man had a familiar expression, though I couldn't place it. Maybe that's why my father always looked at me differently. Maybe I reminded him of someone he couldn't forgive. I closed my eyes, thinking about all the years I had tried to earn his approval. Every time I thought he favored Dylan. Maybe it wasn't favoritism, it was pain. My father's silence suddenly made sense. The house had become a graveyard of things unsaid. The sound of the bell came again, softer this time, almost comforting. I felt tears sting my eyes, not from fear but from the weight of understanding. I had spent my whole life chasing something I already had, a place in his heart, even if broken. I gathered the documents and put them in my bag, determined not to leave them behind. Before leaving the attic, I looked around one last time. The light through the cracks seemed to fade slower than before. I turned the key in the lock again and stepped out. My legs felt heavy on the stairs. I didn't know what to do next. Dylan was probably celebrating his new life with parties and photos online, while I was standing in the middle of ghosts and confessions. Still, I knew I couldn't stop now. Back home, I laid everything out on my kitchen table. The letters, the photos, the birth certificate. I stared at them for hours, searching for meaning in the chaos. Each piece felt like part of a puzzle that refused to fit. I thought about calling Dylan, but I couldn't bring myself to. He wouldn't understand, or worse, he'd twist it to make me look delusional. I realized how alone I really was in all this. The truth wasn't freeing yet, it was just heavy and confusing. I couldn't sleep that night either. My phone buzzed at midnight. It was Dylan posting photos of a party at the mansion. Laughter, champagne, lights. He looked proud, like a man who had everything. I scrolled through them, feeling something between envy and pity. He didn't know any of this, and maybe he never would. I turned off my phone and sat quietly in the dark, the attic key still in my hand. I whispered that I'd go back tomorrow. Somehow I knew there was more waiting for me. Before I tell you what happened next and what I found when I returned to the attic, take a second to support this story, leave a like, subscribe if you haven't yet, and tell me where you're watching from. It means more than you think. The next morning, I woke up early again. I hadn't dreamed, but it felt like I hadn't rested either. My thoughts were stuck on that phrase, For whoever still believes in truth. It sounded like something my father would say, but I wasn't sure anymore. I packed the documents in a folder, grabbed a flashlight, and drove back. The mansion looked different in daylight, less haunting, more lonely. I didn't even bother locking the car. I just walked straight to the door, as if I had done it every day of my life. Inside, everything was exactly as I left it. The sunlight stretched across the hallway, catching the dust in long trails. I took a deep breath and climbed the stairs again. I felt less scared this time, more determined. The attic door opened smoothly, and for a moment I thought I smelled smoke, like something faintly burned long ago. I pushed the thought aside and started checking the corners I hadn't searched yet. Every box I opened felt like a small gamble between finding nothing or everything. Halfway through the room, I found a panel on the wall that looked newer than the rest. The paint didn't match, and the wood was cleaner. I pressed on it and it shifted slightly, like it was meant to open. Behind it was another small compartment, sealed with wax. I used the key to pry it open and found a stack of old postcards inside. Each one was written in my father's handwriting, but none were sent. They were all addressed to my mother. He'd kept them all. Every single one. I read through the first few postcards. The messages were desperate and apologetic. He had begged her to come home, said he couldn't live with the guilt of what happened. My throat tightened as I read line after line of regret. One card stopped me. It mentioned the attic key and the truth upstairs. That's when I knew this wasn't just about lost love or family secrets. My father had wanted me to find these things. He wanted me to see the truth he couldn't face while alive. I sat back and stared at the postcards, wondering why he never mailed them. Maybe he didn't know where she was. Maybe he was too ashamed to try. I suddenly thought of Dylan again. How he always seemed confident, certain, proud. He had built his life on everything Dad gave him, never once questioning how or why. For a second, I wondered if he even knew any of this. Then my phone vibrated, snapping me out of thought. It was Dylan calling. I let it ring. I wasn't ready yet. The attic seemed to creak more as I stayed there. The air grew thicker, warmer. I noticed something strange, a single red thread hanging from the ceiling beam. It dangled perfectly straight, swaying slightly in the still air. I reached for it but stopped halfway. My instincts told me not to touch it. I followed it upward and saw that it disappeared into a small gap in the wood. It didn't belong there. It was as if someone had tied it to mark something, or maybe to warn me. I pulled a chair beneath the beam and climbed up carefully. The closer I got, the more I saw small markings scratched into the wood, initials and dates. One set caught my attention. It was my father's initials carved next to my mother's, and below it was the year she vanished. My hand shook as I traced over the carvings. They looked deliberate, almost like a grave marker. I stepped down slowly, my heart pounding. Whatever happened here wasn't an accident. It was planned, hidden, preserved. Just as I stepped down, I heard footsteps downstairs. My chest tightened instantly. I froze, listening. The sound was steady, slow, and deliberate. I turned off my flashlight and waited, barely breathing. The steps stopped at the bottom of the stairs and silence followed. Then a faint click echoed. A door opening or closing. I wanted to believe it was just wind or the house settling, but the rhythm of those steps sounded too human to ignore. I stayed still until everything went quiet again. When I finally moved, my hands were shaking. I packed the letters and photos quickly, then turned off the attic light. The air felt colder than before, and the smell of dust was stronger. I closed the attic door behind me and stood in the hallway, listening for any more sounds. Nothing. Just the faint ticking of an old wall clock somewhere below. I walked out of the mansion slowly, locking the door behind me. I didn't realize it yet, but someone else already knew I'd been there. That night I got a voicemail from Dylan. His voice sounded angry. He said I needed to stop going through Dad's things and stay away from the house. My blood went cold. How did he know I was there? I hadn't told anyone. I deleted the message but couldn't shake the unease in my chest. He sounded more scared than mad, like he was protecting something. Whatever it was, I had the feeling the attic wasn't the only secret my father left behind. I couldn't ignore Dylan's message. His tone was too sharp, too deliberate. I replayed it twice, listening carefully. There was a faint noise in the background, something metallic like a latch or a chain. He wasn't at home. That realization made my stomach twist. The only place that sound could have come from was the mansion. I felt a pull I couldn't resist. Maybe I was pushing too far, but I needed to know what he was hiding. The truth was already halfway out, and I couldn't go back to pretending. I drove back late at night, headlights off until I reached the driveway. The house stood dark, except for a faint glow coming from one upstairs window, the attic. My chest tightened as I parked near the gate. Dylan's car wasn't outside, which made it worse. That light shouldn't have been on. I walked up slowly, my steps quiet against the gravel. When I pushed the front door open, it made no sound. Inside, the faint hum of electricity filled the air, even though most of the power had been cut days ago. I climbed the stairs carefully, trying not to let them creak. My heart was pounding, but it wasn't fear exactly. It was focus. At the top, the attic door stood slightly open. A dim bulb flickered inside. I could see my own shadow stretching across the floor as I stepped closer. The red thread I'd seen before was gone. The small chest near the center was open, papers scattered around it. I recognized my handwriting on some of them. That meant someone had been reading what I found. Someone wanted me to see this. I knelt beside the open chest, scanning through the mess. The postcards were gone, but the envelope with my birth certificate was still there. On top of it lay another folded paper that hadn't been there before. I opened it carefully. It was a note written by Dylan. He said I should have stayed out of it, that Dad's lies weren't worth digging up. At the bottom he wrote that some truths destroy people. I sat still, staring at those words, realizing this wasn't just about inheritance anymore. This was about protecting an image. I felt an anger I hadn't felt in years. Dylan always wanted to be the hero, the good son, the heir, the one who fixed things. But I could see now that he was trying to protect a lie that kept him on top. I heard a faint creak behind me, the kind the wood made when someone stepped on it. I turned around, but the doorway was empty. Still, the air felt disturbed, as if someone had just moved. My pulse quickened. I wasn't sure if it was Dylan or something else. I decided to leave before things got worse. As I turned off the attic light, a soft sound echoed from below. Footsteps again, this time faster. I froze, then quietly stepped toward the stairs. The house was breathing in its old rhythm, every sound louder than it should have been. Halfway down, my phone buzzed. The vibration felt like a thunderclap in that silence. I looked at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. Just 2 words. Stop digging. My throat went dry. I didn't reply. I just kept walking. By the time I reached my car, I could barely think straight. The night air felt thick, pressing against me. I started the engine, but before I pulled away, I glanced back at the mansion. The attic light had gone out. No flicker, no dim glow, just darkness. It felt final, like someone had shut the lid on a box. I drove off without looking again, but that night I couldn't shake the image of the attic door slightly open and the feeling that something inside wanted to stay buried. The next morning I woke up to find another message on my phone. This time it was from Dylan. He said we needed to talk, in person tonight. No explanation, no apology. I could hear the tension in the text, if that's possible. I agreed because I needed answers, not warnings. The whole day dragged by like slow motion. I tried to work, tried to distract myself, but everything felt hollow. I kept thinking about my father, wondering if this confrontation was what he wanted all along, to force the truth out of both of us. When I arrived that evening, Dylan was already waiting outside. He didn't look angry anymore, just tired. We didn't argue right away. We stood there for a while, looking at the house that once belonged to both of us. He finally said, "Dad made mistakes but loved us in his own way." I stayed quiet, listening because I didn't believe him. He asked if I'd gone into the attic again. I said yes. His face tightened. He said some things were left there for a reason. I asked him whose reason, his or Dad's. That broke whatever calm was left. Dylan sighed and admitted he had known parts of the truth for years. He said Dad told him not to speak of it, to let the past rest. I asked what he was hiding exactly. He looked away and said something I'll never forget. "It wasn't about you being his son. It was about what happened to her." My stomach dropped. He meant Mom. Before I could press for more, he turned and walked into the house. I followed, even though everything in me told me not to. Inside, the air felt heavier than usual, like the house knew what was coming. Dylan led me to Dad's old office instead of the attic. There was a safe built into the wall behind a shelf. He opened it with a small key he had kept hidden for years. Inside were old cassette tapes labeled with years. The latest one was marked 2001, final. He handed it to me without speaking. My hands shook as I took it. That was the year Dad stopped talking about Mom completely. The year everything changed. Dylan didn't explain what was on the tape. He just said, "Listen upstairs. You'll understand." I climbed the stairs slowly, holding that tape like it was alive. The attic door felt colder than before. When I stepped inside, everything was where I had left it. I found an old tape player among the boxes and blew the dust off. It looked ancient but still worked. I pressed play. The soft crackle of static filled the room, followed by my father's voice, shaky, broken, and unlike I'd ever heard it before. He spoke about guilt, about the weight of keeping secrets. He said he had loved both his sons, even if they didn't share the same blood. He confessed that he'd done terrible things out of pride, that he couldn't forgive himself for what happened in that house. I leaned closer as he said, "Mom had tried to leave, but he stopped her." My chest went cold. He said the attic was her space, her sanctuary, and one night they argued there. She fell. There was silence after that, long and unbearable. My father's voice cracked on the tape as he said he never meant for it to happen. He buried the truth and told Dylan she ran away. He told me she was weak. He said he locked the attic after that and couldn't bring himself to open it again. I sat there frozen, my throat tight, the red thread, the perfume, the scratches, they all made sense now. He hadn't just hidden memories, he had built a shrine to his guilt, and I had walked right into it. The tape ended with one final line, "Forgive me if you can." I sat there staring at the player, the static still hissing softly. I didn't know how long I stayed like that, maybe minutes or hours. Eventually I turned it off and just listened to the silence. For the first time it didn't feel haunted, it felt empty. I realized the bell sound I'd heard all along wasn't from outside, it was memory, a loop. My father's way of calling me back, trying to make me see what he couldn't say. I wiped my face and took a deep breath. I wanted to hate him, but I couldn't. Not completely. He had carried this pain until the end, and somehow I felt it now too. I picked up the letters again, noticing small stains that might have been tears or spilled ink. Everything he left me wasn't wealth. It was confession, a heavy inheritance of truth. I looked around the attic, realizing this was no longer a place of fear. It was where everything finally made sense, even if it broke me a little inside. I went downstairs to find Dylan sitting in the living room, staring at the fireplace. He didn't ask what I'd heard, he just knew. For the first time in years we sat quietly, not as rivals but as two people sharing the same wound. He said Dad made him promise to protect me from this. I asked if he ever forgave him. Dylan said no, but he understood. The truth, he said, didn't set anyone free, it just made you see the world without its disguise. I didn't know how to answer that. When I left the mansion that night, the air outside felt different, lighter somehow. The rain finally started, soft and steady, washing dust from the roof. I sat in my car, holding the attic key tightly. I thought about throwing it away but couldn't. It didn't feel like an object anymore. It felt like a connection. The bell sound came faintly again in the distance, carried by the wind. For the first time, it didn't scare me. It just reminded me of how deeply love and regret could be tied together. Driving home, I passed the church on the edge of town. The bell tower light was on, glowing faintly through the rain. That's when I realized something. The bell had always rung near moments of truth. Maybe it wasn't random, maybe it was the universe's strange way of marking change. I pulled over and sat there watching the tower until the light flickered out. I didn't pray or speak, I just let the quiet fill the space where anger used to live. It felt like a small step toward peace. That night I spread the letters, photos, and tape on my desk. I wanted to organize them to make sense of everything. But halfway through I stopped. Some things didn't need to be dissected anymore. They just needed to rest. I put the items back in a box and sealed it. On top I placed the attic key. It felt like closing a chapter, though I didn't know if it was the end. I sat back in my chair and realized that the mansion wasn't the only thing my father left haunted. It was us. The following days felt strange, almost too quiet. Dylan didn't call again. I didn't reach out either. We both needed time to breathe. I went back to work, pretending life was normal, but at night my thoughts drifted to that attic. That voice, those confessions. Sometimes I'd wake up thinking I heard the bell again, faint and far away. I would just lie there listening, not afraid anymore. Maybe guilt doesn't vanish. It just softens when you finally understand where it came from. A week later, I got a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a short note written in Dylan's handwriting. It said, "I can't keep the mansion. It doesn't belong to either of us." There was a small envelope taped to the back with the property papers signed over to me. I didn't know what to feel. Relief wasn't the right word. Maybe closure. Maybe sadness. I held that paper and realized the real inheritance wasn't the house. It was the truth, passed like a burden neither of us wanted. I didn't go to the mansion right away. I left the documents on my kitchen counter and tried to focus on small things instead: laundry, dishes, work emails. But every simple task felt meaningless. My mind kept returning to the attic. I needed to see it one last time, not as a place of secrets, but as the end of something. The next weekend I finally went back. The drive felt easier this time. The rain had stopped, and sunlight broke through the clouds, lighting up the old driveway. Inside, everything was still. Dust hung in the air like it had been waiting. I climbed the stairs one last time, each step echoing softly. The attic was unchanged, but it didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt quiet, almost peaceful. I walked to the window and looked out at the trees swaying in the breeze. For a long time, I just stood there breathing. The guilt, the lies, the anger, it all felt smaller now, like background noise, fading after a long storm. I whispered a goodbye. I didn't need to explain. Before leaving, I placed the attic key on the same chest where I first found the letters. It felt like the right place to leave it. That key had unlocked everything I didn't know I needed to face. As I turned to go, sunlight fell across the floor, warming the space. It wasn't a sign or a message, just light finding its way in. For the first time I smiled, not from joy but from relief. The past was no longer chasing me. It was finally still. When I stepped outside the house, the air felt cleaner, almost new. I locked the front door for the last time and slid the key into my pocket, though I didn't know why. Maybe part of me still needed to hold on. As I walked down the long driveway, the crunch of gravel sounded softer than before. The mansion looked smaller now, not because it changed, but because the weight it held inside had finally lifted. I thought of Dylan, wondering if he'd ever come back or if he was gone for good. That night I couldn't shake the image of him sitting by the fire, silent and broken. He had always looked untouchable, confident, proud. Now I saw him for what he really was. A man holding everything together with lies and guilt. I realized we weren't that different. We both grew up in the shadow of a man who couldn't face what he'd done. Maybe the attic broke us in different ways. I hoped Dylan would find his own peace someday, even if it meant letting go of everything he once called success. Days passed quietly. I spent mornings walking through the neighborhood, something I hadn't done in years. The world looked different when you weren't carrying resentment. I started to notice small things again. The sound of birds, the smell of coffee drifting from nearby houses, the way sunlight caught on car windows. I wasn't healed, not completely, but I was learning to breathe differently. I kept thinking about Dad's final words on that tape. "Forgive me if you can." I wasn't sure I could, but maybe forgiveness wasn't a single moment. Maybe it was slow. I went through some of Dad's remaining boxes, the ones stored in my apartment after he passed. Most of it was paperwork, but one folder caught my eye. Inside were old financial records, letters, and a few property maps. There was a note clipped to one page, written in his old typewriter font. It said, "Not all debts are financial." That line hit me harder than anything else I'd found. Maybe he had spent years trying to balance a ledger that wasn't about money at all, but about conscience. I started visiting the local cafe every morning, something Dad used to do when we were kids. The owner, an older woman, remembered him. She told me he always sat in the corner, ordered black coffee, and stared out the window for hours. She said he looked like a man waiting for someone who never came. Hearing that made my chest ache. I thanked her and left quietly. For the rest of the day I couldn't stop thinking about that image. Dad sitting there alone, haunted and hoping for forgiveness that never arrived. One evening I took the drive back out to the mansion again. The sun was setting and the sky was painted in dull gold. I didn't go inside this time. I just stood at the gate and watched as the light shifted across the windows. I realized how strange it was that something once filled with life could stand so still, holding decades of memories that refused to fade. It wasn't a house anymore, it was a confession built from wood and silence, and somehow I had become the last one left to understand it. I walked around the perimeter of the property, tracing the fence line like I used to as a child. The ground was damp, and the smell of earth reminded me of summer days when Mom used to garden behind the house. I stopped near the old oak tree where she once tied a swing for Dylan and me. The rope was gone, but the branch still carried the marks. I closed my eyes and tried to remember her laugh. It had been buried under years of anger and noise, but now it came back clearly. That night I found myself replaying old memories instead of avoiding them. The times Dad took us fishing, the rare moments he smiled genuinely, the way he used to pat Dylan's shoulder and ruffle my hair. Those small gestures felt meaningless back then, but now I saw them differently. Maybe they were his quiet attempts to make peace with his guilt, small ways of saying sorry without words. Regret can twist people into strange shapes. Maybe he wasn't a bad man, just a broken one who didn't know how to repair himself. I thought about what I should do with the mansion. Selling it felt wrong, keeping it felt heavier. I went back and forth for days, unsure what would bring real closure. Then one morning I woke up knowing the answer. I'd turn it into something better. A small home for families in need, a place to start over. Maybe the house could finally heal by giving others a new beginning. I didn't tell Dylan right away, but deep down, I knew he would agree. It was the least we could do. Turning that decision into reality wasn't easy. There were papers to file, lawyers to talk to, repairs to plan, but for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was living in my brother's shadow. I had purpose. The attic wasn't a secret anymore, it was a story, one that could finally end with something good. Each day I spent working on the house, I felt lighter. Maybe Dad had left me the key because he knew I'd be the one to open more than just a door. Weeks later, I walked through the house again with a small group of volunteers. We started clearing the lower rooms, removing furniture, and opening windows that hadn't been touched in years. The sunlight poured in, bright and sharp. I could almost imagine Mom's voice echoing faintly through the hallways. The house didn't feel cursed anymore. It felt ready. Every hammer strike, every broom sweep, sounded like forgiveness, quiet, steady, patient. We were giving something broken a second chance, the same thing I had been searching for all along. I kept the attic closed while we worked on the rest. Part of me still saw it as sacred ground. It wasn't fear anymore, it was respect. Some things didn't need to be disturbed again. I told the workers to leave it untouched, and they did. Occasionally I'd glance at the locked door when I passed by. The sunlight from the hallway sometimes hit it just right, making it glow faintly. It reminded me of how truth can hurt, but it can also guide you if you stop running from it. One afternoon, Dylan showed up unannounced. He looked thinner, worn out, but calmer than I'd ever seen him. We walked through the house together without saying much. When he saw the changes, his eyes softened. He said it felt different, alive again. I told him about the plan to turn it into a home for others. He nodded and said that's what Dad would have wanted, even if he never said it. For the first time, we didn't argue. We just stood there quietly, sharing a peace we had both fought too long to find. We walked up to the second floor together, stopping outside the attic door. Dylan stared at it for a long time, his jaw tight. I could tell he was remembering the same things I was. The fear, the silence, the tension that lived behind that wood for decades. He said he hadn't been up there since we were kids. I told him I'd rather keep it that way. He nodded, and for once we agreed without speaking another word. We left it locked, letting the past stay exactly where it belonged. Over the next few months, the project moved faster than I expected. Local businesses donated materials, volunteers showed up every weekend, and little by little the mansion started to change. The walls were repainted, the floors polished, and the once quiet rooms filled with laughter and chatter. I started to feel like the house was breathing again. I'd walk through it sometimes and imagine my parents there, Mom tending to her plants, Dad sitting by the window no longer haunted. It was a strange comfort, like they were finally free too. There were nights I'd still hear the faint bell sound, usually when I was alone, working late in one of the rooms. It never scared me. It felt like a reminder, a quiet signal that the truth was still here, just no longer heavy. The bell didn't mean warning anymore. It meant peace. Sometimes I'd stop what I was doing and listen until it faded. Then I'd smile, close my eyes, and keep working. The house wasn't just healing, it was teaching me how to forgive without needing answers. As time passed, Dylan and I started meeting regularly again. We'd grab coffee or drive to the house together on weekends. It wasn't perfect between us, but it was honest. We talked about Dad sometimes, about Mom, about how both of them were trapped by choices that defined their lives. One day Dylan said something that stuck with me. He said, "We inherited more than a house. We inherited the chance to do better." He was right. For once I wasn't just my father's son or my brother's shadow, I was myself. The first family moved into the house that winter. A young couple with 2 kids, both looking nervous and grateful. I handed them the keys and showed them around, explaining how the house had history, but now it had hope too. They smiled and said it felt warm, like it had been waiting for them. When I left that evening, I stood at the gate for a while, watching the lights inside flicker on. For the first time, the mansion looked alive, not with secrets, but with new beginnings. I thought about my father a lot that night, about how he probably never imagined this outcome when he left me that key. Maybe he just wanted me to understand him even if it took years. I realized I didn't need to forgive everything he did. Some wounds stay deep, but I could honor what he tried to fix, even if he failed. I whispered a quiet thank you before getting in my car. The attic key might have started all this, but love was what kept it going. Months later, I received a letter from the first family living in the mansion. They said strange things sometimes happened there. Lights flickering, soft sounds at night, a bell ringing faintly near the attic. They weren't scared though. They said it felt gentle, almost protective. I smiled when I read that. Maybe Dad's spirit was finally calm, not haunting but guarding. The past didn't vanish. It just found a quieter place to rest. I wrote back telling them the house had always needed voices again. They were the perfect ones to fill it. Life settled into something steady. Dylan moved out of the city and started a small workshop, saying he wanted to build things that lasted longer than money. I visited sometimes and we'd talk for hours without bitterness. We laughed about childhood memories we once avoided, realizing how much we had missed by competing instead of caring. The truth had changed everything, but not in the way I expected. It didn't destroy us. It rebuilt us. Not perfectly, but enough to keep moving forward. That was more than I'd ever hoped for. On the anniversary of Dad's passing, I went back to the mansion alone. It was quiet again, but in a different way, peaceful, not heavy. I walked up the stairs and stopped by the attic door. I didn't unlock it. I didn't need to. I placed my hand on the wood and whispered, "We're okay now." The wind outside picked up, and for a second, I thought I heard the faint ringing of that bell again. It felt like an answer, soft and distant. I smiled and walked away. I sat on the porch for a long time after that, watching the sky turn from gold to gray. The house behind me no longer loomed over my memories. It stood quietly, part of the world again. I thought about how something as small as a key had started this entire journey. It didn't open just a door, it opened understanding. Maybe that was the point all along. My father gave me what I needed, not what I wanted. Sometimes that's the only kind of love people know how to give. Before leaving, I walked down to the garden where Mom used to plant her roses. A few wild ones had started growing there again, pushing through the weeds. I knelt and brushed the petals gently, realizing how much they reminded me of her, resilient, soft, still finding ways to bloom in the ruins. I picked one and placed it on the porch rail before heading to my car. The air smelled like rain again, the same scent that followed me since the first night I turned that attic key. Driving home, I felt light in a way I hadn't in years. The road stretched ahead, clean and quiet. I thought about everything, the lies, the letters, the sound of the bell, the way truth can hurt and heal at the same time. I didn't know if Dad could hear me wherever he was, but I whispered anyway. I understand now. The mansion faded in my rearview mirror, smaller with every mile, until it was just a memory. What once trapped us had finally set us free. Weeks later, I woke up to a message from Dylan. He said he was visiting town and wanted to meet for lunch. I agreed without hesitation. We met at a small diner halfway between our homes. When I saw him, he looked different. Peaceful, grounded. Over coffee, we talked about everything but the past. It felt good. We laughed about things that once divided us, realizing time had softened what used to feel sharp. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. Maybe it was about choosing to see each other as human again. After lunch, we drove to the house together one last time. It was fully renovated now, bright and full of life. Children's laughter echoed from inside as families moved around. It didn't feel like ours anymore, and that was okay. It belonged to people who needed it more. Dylan stood beside me, smiling faintly. He said, "You did good with this place." I told him we both did. We walked the garden path in silence, and for the first time since childhood, it felt like we were brothers again. Not rivals, just brothers. We stood at the edge of the property watching sunlight fall over the windows. Dylan said he still heard the bell sometimes when he thought about Dad. I told him I did too. He laughed quietly and said, maybe it was Dad's way of making sure we kept our promises. That idea stayed with me. Some things never leave you, they just change shape. The mansion had once been our burden, but now it was our shared redemption. It was strange how something broken could end up teaching us how to mend. After that day, Dylan went back to his town and we talked less often but with more meaning. Our conversations felt real now, not forced. I started writing about what happened, not as a confession but as a story, one that others could learn from. I didn't use our real names. I just called it the attic key. Writing it helped me make sense of everything. The guilt, the forgiveness, the love that hid inside silence. It was strange how much lighter words felt once I stopped carrying them inside. One evening while I was finishing the story, I heard the bell again, faint and steady. It came through my open window, blending with the sound of crickets. I didn't move or look outside. I just listened. It wasn't eerie anymore. It was comforting, like a reminder that the past was still part of me, but no longer ruling me. The sound faded slowly, leaving a silence so complete it almost hummed. I smiled to myself, whispering that maybe Dad had finally found peace too. Maybe we all had. When the book was finished, I printed a few copies and sent one to Dylan. He called a week later, emotional but happy. He said reading it felt like closing a door he didn't know was still open. That meant everything to me. Sometimes sharing the truth doesn't just heal you, it heals the people who live through it with you. The story wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and that was enough. It was proof that something painful could turn into something gentle if you stopped running from it. I kept one copy of the book on my desk. Every morning I'd read a few lines before starting my day. It reminded me where I came from and why peace had taken so long to find. One morning I looked at the attic key I had kept all this time, now resting beside the book. It was old and worn, but its shine had returned slightly. I realized I couldn't keep it forever. It wasn't mine to own anymore. It belonged back where it started, home. That afternoon I drove back to the mansion. The new families greeted me warmly, offering tea and smiles. I told them I just wanted to visit the attic one last time. They agreed, though one of them mentioned they rarely went up there. The air upstairs was cool and still. When I reached the door, I unlocked it slowly. The attic looked almost the same but brighter. The sunlight from the roof filled every corner, washing away the gloom. It didn't feel like a secret anymore. It felt sacred. I walked to the old chest where everything had started. The surface was polished now, the wood lighter from the years. I placed the attic key on top and whispered, "Thank you." I didn't expect an answer, but the floor creaked softly beneath me, almost like acknowledgement. I smiled, realizing how strange comfort can be. Sometimes it comes from the quietest places. I turned to leave, not looking back. I didn't need to. The house didn't hold me anymore. It simply stood, alive, doing what it was meant to do, shelter. As I stepped outside, the air smelled like rain again. The clouds were darkening in the distance, and a soft wind passed through the trees. I sat on the porch steps for a while, letting the calm soak in. The sound of children laughing floated from inside, mixing with the breeze. That sound meant more to me than any apology could. It was proof that the house, and maybe my father too, had finally found a new purpose. The storm didn't scare me anymore. It just felt cleansing. Later that night, I drove to the old cafe again. The same woman was behind the counter, smiling as she recognized me. She asked if I was still fixing up that house. I told her it was finished and full of people now. She said my father would have been proud. I nodded but didn't say anything. Pride wasn't what I wanted from him anymore. I just wanted to understand, and I finally did. When I left, the bell above the cafe door rang, and for a second it sounded exactly like his. Over the next few weeks I started sleeping better. The nightmares stopped, replaced by small, peaceful dreams. Mom humming near the garden, Dad sitting by the fire, Dylan laughing at something ridiculous. It was strange how grief transforms over time. It doesn't vanish, it just changes color, fading from sharp black to softer gray. I learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering without breaking. That realization made me grateful for everything. Even the painful parts. The attic, the lies, the truth, they all led me to this quiet peace. One morning I received a letter from the family in the mansion. They enclosed a photograph their daughter had taken near the attic door. A faint streak of light appeared in the shape of a figure, soft and hazy. They said it looked like someone smiling. I stared at it for a long time. Whether it was light, dust, or something else didn't matter. To me it was Dad saying goodbye the only way he knew how, silently. I framed the photo and placed it beside the book and the last letter he wrote me. Dylan visited again that weekend, bringing his wife and son. We all went to see the house together. Watching him with his kid reminded me of our father, but in a better way. He was gentle, patient, the kind of dad we both wished we'd had. That's how cycles break, not by forgetting but by doing better. As we left, his son waved at the attic window, saying he thought someone was up there. We just smiled and said, maybe. Some things don't need to be explained. They're meant to be felt. That night, after everyone went home, I drove to the cemetery where Dad was buried. The grass was overgrown, and the stone was simple, unadorned. I placed a small rose on it, the same kind that grew near the mansion. I didn't cry this time. I just stood there quietly, letting the moment settle. I whispered that I forgave him, not because he deserved it, but because I needed to. The wind blew softly through the trees, carrying that same faint bell tone. It sounded like peace, not sorrow. I walked through the cemetery slowly, thinking about everything that had changed. The mansion, the attic, the truth, it all felt far away now, like another life. I realized the key was never about unlocking a door. It was about opening the part of me that refused to see the past clearly. My father's biggest mistake was silence, and mine was resentment. Somewhere between those two, I found understanding. I smiled at that thought, feeling lighter than ever before. Maybe some stories don't end, they just stop hurting. As the days turned into months, the mansion became a small legend in town. People talked about the house of second chances, a place where families rebuilt their lives. I visited less often, but I always drove by during the holidays. It stood proud and warm, its windows glowing in the night. Each time I saw it, I felt a strange mix of sadness and gratitude. The past never truly leaves, but it can live differently, through kindness, through legacy, through love that survives even the hardest truths. Dylan and I kept in touch, our bond growing stronger with time. We never went back to being the brothers we were as kids, but we became something better, men who finally understood each other. We talked about Mom sometimes, wondering what she'd think if she could see what became of us. I liked to believe she'd be proud. She had always been the quiet balance in our loud family, the one who believed peace was worth fighting for. Maybe she was right all along. We just took too long to see it. Every once in a while I'd take evening walks around the neighborhood just to clear my head. One night I passed by a church, and the bell rang softly in the distance. It made me stop in my tracks. The sound didn't bring back pain anymore, it brought reflection. I thought of how everything started with that one small key, and how that key had changed not just my life, but everyone connected to it. It was proof that truth, no matter how painful, can be the first step toward freedom. Sometimes I caught myself missing the attic, not for what it held but for what it taught me. It showed me how easily we bury parts of ourselves and call it strength. It taught me that silence can be both shield and prison. But most of all, it showed me that love doesn't disappear, even when it's broken. It lingers quietly, waiting for someone brave enough to open the door and face it. I was that person now, and for once I was proud of that. One afternoon I got an invitation to a small celebration at the mansion. The families living there had organized a dinner to thank everyone who helped restore it. I went, and it felt like walking into a warm memory. The halls were filled with laughter, music, and the smell of food. The attic stayed closed, but its presence was felt like an old guardian watching from above. I didn't need to open it to know it was still part of everything, woven into the walls, the air, and the light. As I stood in the doorway, one of the children handed me a small drawing. It showed a house with sunlight streaming from the roof and a bell floating above it. The kid said they drew it because they sometimes heard bells when they were happy. I smiled and thanked them, my throat tight. That was the moment I knew everything had come full circle. The bell no longer marked guilt or loss. It marked life, growth, and healing. I folded the drawing carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket. When I left the party that night, the sky was clear, stars sharp and bright. I walked to my car slowly, taking one last look at the glowing house behind me. It didn't need me anymore, and that was the best part. It was alive, full of people, stories, and laughter, everything it was always meant to hold. The wind carried the faint sound of a bell once more, and I smiled. Maybe some sounds follow you forever, not to haunt but to remind you that you survived. Driving home, I thought about how strange life can be. You can spend years chasing what you think you deserve, only to find that what you truly need was hidden all along. The attic key wasn't a prize, it was an invitation to face the truth, to see the man my father really was, and the man I could become. Some inheritances come in gold, others in pain, but the rarest kind comes in lessons that last a lifetime. That was my father's final gift. When I finally got home, I placed the child's drawing beside my framed photo and the book I'd written. I looked at them all together and realized something important. Every piece of this journey, from the will to the attic, had been leading here to quiet, to peace, to understanding. I turned off the light, sat by the window, and watched the moon rise. Somewhere far away, a bell rang softly, and I whispered, "Good night, Dad." The sound lingered in the air, calm and steady, before fading into the silence. The next morning felt unusually calm. Sunlight spilled through the blinds, and for once I didn't wake up with a heaviness in my chest. I brewed coffee and sat quietly, listening to the faint hum of life outside. It struck me how ordinary peace felt when you finally earned it. I opened the window, letting in the cool morning air, and for a brief second I thought I heard the distant bell again. It wasn't haunting anymore. It sounded like a greeting, gentle and familiar, as if the world itself had exhaled. I decided to visit the mansion one last time before moving forward completely. The drive felt easy, almost nostalgic. When I arrived, I parked near the gate and watched as children ran across the yard, chasing each other through patches of sunlight. Their laughter filled the air like music. I walked to the porch, and one of the residents waved, inviting me in for tea. I smiled and declined politely. I just wanted to see the place, not as its past, but as what it had become, a home again. Standing there, I could see every window glowing softly in the late afternoon light. The same house that once felt heavy with secrets now looked alive, breathing and full of warmth. I felt tears rise unexpectedly, not from sadness but from gratitude. I whispered a thank you under my breath. Thank you to my father for the key, to my mother for her quiet strength, and even to Dylan for forcing me to face the truth. Without all of it, I wouldn't have found this peace. I turned to leave, smiling faintly. As I walked down the driveway, I noticed something shining in the grass near the old oak tree. It was small and gold, half buried in the soil. I bent down and picked it up. It was another key, older, thinner, rusted. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't recognize it, and for a moment I just stood there holding it, unsure what to think. Maybe it belonged to the past. Maybe it didn't matter. I smiled to myself, deciding to leave it there. Not every door needs to be opened. Some are better left closed. I sat under that same oak tree for a while, letting the sun warm my face. The branches above swayed softly in the breeze, and I realized how full circle everything felt. This was the same tree Mom had once tied our swing to, the same one Dad used to sit under with his coffee. So much time had passed, yet the ground still remembered. It was a comforting thought that places hold memory, but also renewal. Maybe we're not meant to erase what hurt us, only to live differently beside it. On the drive home, I rolled the windows down. The air smelled like fresh rain and earth, the same scent that had followed me since that first night I found the key. Only now it didn't carry fear. It carried familiarity, like a reminder that even pain can become part of who you are without defining you. The road stretched out endlessly ahead, and for the first time I didn't feel like I was running from something. I was moving toward the rest of my life, and that felt right. When I got home, I took out the framed photograph of the attic window, the one the family had sent me. The faint figure in the light looked more peaceful than ever. I set it beside the book and the drawing from the child, creating a small corner of remembrance. It wasn't a shrine. It was a story's ending. Every piece carried its own weight, but together they felt complete. I realized that healing doesn't come from forgetting the past. It comes from giving it a place to rest quietly within you. Over time, people who read my story reached out. They said it made them call their parents, forgive old grudges, or revisit things they'd buried for years. Every message felt like a small echo of my father's lesson, that truth, when faced with courage, ripples outward. I didn't respond to everyone, but I read every word. It amazed me how something born from pain could inspire connection. It reminded me that stories like people can turn from burden to bridge if shared with honesty. That was the gift my father never realized he gave. One afternoon, I received a letter from Dylan. Inside was a photograph of him with his son, standing in front of the workshop he'd built. The boy was holding a small wooden carving of a key. Dylan wrote that he'd told him the story, our story, but changed the ending. In his version, the key didn't open an attic. It opened courage. I laughed softly when I read that. He had understood everything in his own way. It was strange how we both took the same past and built something new from it. The years began to move quietly after that. The mansion continued to thrive. Dylan's family grew, and I found peace in simplicity. I spent my mornings writing, my evenings walking by the sea, and my nights falling asleep to calm instead of regret. Sometimes when storms rolled in and thunder rumbled far away, I'd imagine Dad somewhere in that sound, steady, quiet, finally resting. The guilt that once haunted him had turned into something gentler. Maybe forgiveness doesn't just heal the living, maybe it frees the dead too. On the anniversary of the day I first used the attic key, I drove to the coastline at dawn. The horizon glowed faintly pink as waves broke against the rocks. I took the old key I had kept and threw it gently into the sea. It sank fast, disappearing beneath the surface. I stood there for a while, feeling the wind against my face. That simple act felt like closure. The past didn't belong to me anymore. It belonged to the world. I whispered goodbye, not with sadness but with gratitude. The following morning, I woke to an email from the family at the mansion. They said the attic door had swung open on its own during the night, even though it had been locked for years. Inside, everything was undisturbed, except the chest. It was open, empty, and glowing faintly in the morning light. I read the message twice, smiling quietly. Some things can't be explained, and they don't need to be. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe it was Dad's final way of saying, "You did it." Either way, it felt right. Life moved on in the gentlest way possible. I stopped expecting big moments to define me. Instead, it was the small ones, the quiet mornings, the kind strangers, the laughter of kids near the mansion that carried meaning. The world didn't owe me closure. I had found it myself, piece by piece, by learning to let go. Sometimes I still dreamed of the attic, but now it was filled with light. No shadows, no secrets, just a window open to the sky, and the sound of a distant bell ringing softly beyond it. Years later, the mansion was featured in a local newspaper. They called it the House of Forgiveness. The article talked about how it had become a symbol of hope for families starting over. I cut out the page and pinned it above my desk. Seeing that headline made me realize something beautiful. My father had once filled that house with pain, but now it was filled with love. The story had changed. Maybe redemption isn't about undoing what's done, it's about planting something better in the ruins left behind. I visited Dad's grave again that year, this time with Dylan and his son. The boy placed a small wooden key on the headstone, the one he'd carved himself. We stood there quietly, no tears, no words, just a shared silence that said everything. The bell from a nearby church rang 3 times, soft and clear. We all looked up at the sky, smiling faintly. It wasn't goodbye anymore. It was a continuation, a reminder that even the most broken stories can still find their way to peace. Driving home afterward, I realized how different everything felt now. There was no weight in my chest, no ache in my stomach, just calm. The mansion, the attic, the letters, they had become chapters in a story that shaped me but no longer defined me. I understood now that peace isn't found by erasing the past. It's found by walking through it until it no longer hurts to remember. That's what the attic key truly unlocked, the courage to face truth without fear. The rest had followed naturally. That evening I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunset fade into orange and gold. The wind carried faint chimes from somewhere down the street, and for a moment they sounded just like the old bell. I smiled and closed my eyes. I didn't need signs anymore to know Dad was at peace. The proof was all around me, in laughter, in forgiveness, in the quiet rhythm of life continuing. I whispered one last thank you, not to him, but to the journey itself. It had saved me. Over time, people stopped asking about the story, and that was okay. Not every truth needs to stay loud. Some deserved a rest. I kept writing, not about ghosts or guilt, but about resilience. How people rebuild after everything falls apart. Every character I wrote carried a small piece of my father, my mother, and even Dylan. I realized the attic had become my first story, and maybe my best one, because it was real. And the real ones, no matter how painful, are the ones that last. One evening I received a package with no return address. Inside was a single postcard. On the front was a photo of the mansion at dusk. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, it said, "Some homes never stop teaching." I turned it over again, smiling. Maybe it was from Dylan, or maybe from someone who had lived there and felt what I once did. Either way, the message was true. The house wasn't just a place, it was a reminder that truth, when faced, turns into peace that never leaves. Years passed quietly. My hair turned gray, my hands slower, but my heart lighter. Sometimes I'd walk by the sea and think of how strange it was that everything started with one forgotten key. How something so small could change an entire life. I no longer needed to explain it to anyone. The meaning was mine, and it was enough. Life had given me pain, truth, and healing, in that order, and somehow it had all balanced out in the end. That was my inheritance, the peace to keep walking. As I grew older, I found myself returning to the idea that every family carries its own attic, places of memory, of silence, of truth waiting to be faced. Maybe mine had been locked for too long, but at least I opened it. At least I looked inside. Not everyone gets that chance, and I was grateful for it. Whenever I heard the faint sound of bells, even from far away, I'd stop and smile. It reminded me that the past was still part of me, but gently, quietly, and kindly so. Eventually, I visited the mansion one last time. It had changed again. New paint, new faces, new laughter. The families greeted me warmly, though few knew who I really was. I liked it that way. I wandered the halls slowly, feeling the warmth in every corner. When I reached the attic door, I paused. It was open now, filled with light, and inside a small wind chime hung from the ceiling, tinkling softly. The sound echoed the old bell, faint but alive. I stood there smiling, knowing this was how it should end. Leaving the mansion that day, I didn't feel sadness. I felt completion. The story that began with rivalry, guilt, and silence had ended with love, understanding, and peace. The house stood behind me as a witness to everything that had changed. I realized then that closure isn't the absence of pain, it's the ability to walk away without needing answers. I got in my car, looked back one final time, and whispered goodbye. The wind carried the faint sound of the chime, and I let it fade behind me. Years later, people still told stories about the mansion and the families who lived there. They said its attic was special, that people felt calmer when they stood beneath it. Some said it was haunted by kindness, not ghosts. I liked that idea. Maybe my father's spirit had turned into something gentle that watched over those walls. Maybe love, once freed from guilt, never truly disappears. It just changes shape. The mansion's story outlived all of us, but that's how legacies are supposed to be: quiet, steady, eternal. Now, looking back at everything, I understand why Dad left me the attic key. It wasn't punishment, it was trust. He knew I'd seek the truth even when it hurt, that I'd choose understanding over comfort. The mansion, the attic, the bell, they were lessons written in walls and sound. And though the story has ended, the peace it gave me never will. Every time I hear a bell, faint and distant, I smile, because I know the truth doesn't haunt me anymore. It lives quietly inside me, just like love does.